Most people think they know why the American Civil War happened. Ask anyone and you will get the same clean answer: slavery. The North wanted to end it. The South wanted to keep it. They fought. The good guys won. It is a tidy story with a clear moral center and a clear villain. The problem with that version is not that it is wrong. The problem is that it stops precisely where the real explanation begins. Because when you follow the money across 5 decades, through the cotton ledgers, the bank transfer records, the congressional debates over tariffs and territories, and the mortgage instruments held in the vaults of institutions whose names have changed but whose successors still operate today, the Civil War does not look like a sudden moral reckoning. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. It looks like the violent end of a financial architecture that had been accumulating contradictions since the founding of the Republic, a system so deeply embedded in the structure of American capitalism that neither region, neither North nor South, could extract itself without tearing something fundamental apart. Slavery was the center of this war. That is beyond dispute, and nothing that follows should be read as suggesting otherwise. But slavery was the center because it was the foundation of the most valuable capital stock in the United States, because it financed the cotton trade that powered the Atlantic economy, because it generated the mortgage instruments and the credit lines and the political power that determined who governed the country and who did not. The enslaved were not merely laborers. They were the collateral on which the credit of entire states rested. They were the asset against which London banks extended lines of credit to Southern planters, and against which Southern banks issued paper that circulated as currency across the region. When you understand what the financial record shows, placed alongside the political account, the war stops looking like an argument about human dignity that finally went too far. It starts looking like what it was: the collapse of a financial system that the men who built it could not reform without destroying themselves, and that they chose to defend with rifles and artillery rather than surrender. To understand where the collapse began, you have to go back not to Fort Sumter in 1861, but to a congressional chamber in Washington 33 years earlier, when the first structural fracture between North and South was cut into law. In 1828, Congress passed what its opponents immediately renamed the Tariff of Abominations. It imposed duties on imported manufactured goods at rates that sometimes approached 50%. The official justification was protecting the growing factory economy of the northern states from cheaper British competition. What it actually did was transfer wealth from one region to another through a mechanism so direct that even its architects could not fully obscure it. The southern states at that time ran an export economy built around cash crops, primarily cotton, tobacco, rice, and sugar, all of which depended on trade with Europe and especially with Great Britain. Southern planters exported their raw materials to British mills and factories and imported British manufactured goods in return. The relationship was mutually sustaining. Britain needed Southern cotton to feed its industrial revolution. The South needed British goods because the region had almost no manufacturing base of its own. When Northern politicians pushed through a tariff that dramatically raised the cost of those British imports, the South paid the price through inflated costs on everything it needed to buy, while receiving no corresponding benefit on what it sold. It was a wealth transfer enforced by federal law, and the South understood it in precisely those terms. The reaction in South Carolina was not merely political outrage, it produced a constitutional doctrine. Vice President John C. Calhoun, writing anonymously in what became known as the South Carolina Exposition and Protest, laid out the argument for nullification, the idea that a state retained the sovereign right to declare any federal law it deemed unconstitutional to be null and void within its own borders. Consider what that means. 3 decades before the first shot of the war was fired, a sitting Vice President of the United States was constructing the legal and philosophical framework for secession. He was doing it not over slavery directly, but over a tax dispute, and the distinction matters only until you pull the thread and find that the two were inseparable from the beginning. The reason the South had no manufacturing was because its entire economic model was built on plantation agriculture, powered by enslaved labor. The reason it was so dependent on British trade was because that model produced raw materials, not finished goods. The tariff and slavery were one problem wearing 2 faces. The nullification crisis of 1832 brought the country to the edge of open conflict. South Carolina formally adopted an ordinance declaring both the 1828 and 1832 tariffs null and void within its borders, and explicitly threatened secession if the federal government tried to enforce them. President Andrew Jackson responded with the Force Bill, authorizing military collection of the revenue. Henry Clay's compromise tariff pulled the nation back from the edge in 1833, But the episode left something permanent behind. The precedent had been set. A Southern state had openly threatened to leave the Union, and the federal government had been forced to negotiate rather than simply govern. Secession was no longer theoretical. It was a loaded instrument that had already been pointed once, put down, and not forgotten. The men who would lead the Confederacy to secession in 1861 had been born into a political culture that already knew secession was possible, had watched it nearly succeed, and had filed away the lesson. What made that instrument so dangerous in the decades that followed was the financial reality it was protecting. By 1860, enslaved human beings were the single most valuable asset class in the entire United States. The roughly 4 million men, women, and children held in bondage were collectively valued at approximately $3.5 billion in the currency of the time. That figure exceeded the combined value of every railroad, every factory, and every commercial bank in the country. It represented close to 20% of the nation's total wealth. In today's terms, the figure translates to something in the range of $13 trillion or more. The slaveholding class of the American South was not defending a social custom or a way of life in the abstract. They were defending the largest concentration of capital in the Western Hemisphere, and they were defending their balance sheets with the same calculation that any creditor applies when the asset backing their loans is threatened with elimination. The standard account centers slavery as the moral cause of the war, while quietly leaving out the degree to which that capital was national rather than Southern. Northern banks financed the cotton trade at every stage. Northern insurance companies wrote policies on enslaved people, treating them as property against which losses could be claimed in court, insuring them for transportation, for hire, for accident, and for death, with the same instruments applied to livestock or machinery. Northern shipping firms carried cotton from Southern ports to European textile mills and returned with manufactured goods that Southern planters purchased on credit, extended by those same Northern financial houses. The predecessors of institutions that survived well into the 20th century, including what eventually became Citibank, conducted enormous volumes of business that flowed directly from the slave economy, advancing capital to Southern factors and collecting their commissions on each transaction without any institutional record suggesting discomfort with the underlying system. Merchant banking houses in London extended lines of credit to Southern planters through agents in New Orleans, Charleston, and Natchez, effectively bankrolling the westward expansion of the plantation system into Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas over the course of 4 decades. In Louisiana alone, one institution, the Citizens Bank, held mortgages on nearly 9% of all enslaved workers in the state's most productive sugar parishes. The structure was not hidden, it was standard commercial practice. Southern banks, for their part, developed financial instruments specifically designed to accommodate human property as collateral, creating mortgage-backed securities in which enslaved people were the underlying asset, structures that functioned with the cold efficiency of modern commodity markets and that were accepted without hesitation by Northern counterparties who had their own reasons not to examine the underlying collateral too closely. The wealth generated by enslaved labor did not stay in the South. It moved through cotton factors and commission merchants into the commodity exchanges of New York, into railroad construction, into real estate speculation, into the capitalization of Northern industry. A significant portion of the industrial capital that made the North so economically powerful in 1860 had been built, at some remove, on the same foundation the South was fighting to preserve. The Civil War was not a conflict between a slave economy and a free one. It was a conflict between two regions that had both been drawing from the same source, one of which had organized its entire social and political order around that source, and one of which had constructed something different on top of it, while maintaining deliberate ignorance about the foundation beneath. The political crisis that made war unavoidable was not about abolition. The Republicans who won the presidency in 1860 did not run on a platform of freeing the enslaved. Abraham Lincoln made his position explicit in his debates with Stephen Douglas in 1858. He believed slavery was morally wrong, he opposed its spread into the Western territories, and he had no constitutional authority to interfere with it where it already existed. The platform was containment. To the Southern slaveholding class, containment was not a moderate position. It was an existential threat, because the cotton economy had an inherent biological problem with its land. Intensive cotton cultivation depleted soil rapidly. A plantation that was productive in Virginia in 1790 needed new land by 1810, and the search for that land had driven the plantation system steadily westward across the century, from the original tobacco-growing regions of the Atlantic coast into the rich bottomlands of the Deep South, and then into Texas. If slavery could not expand into the Western territories, it would eventually be hemmed in on all sides by free states and slowly strangled. not by abolitionists but by simple soil exhaustion. The expansion question was also, and perhaps primarily, a question about political power in the most direct sense. The balance of the Senate, maintained for decades through the careful arithmetic of admitting slave states and free states in matched pairs, was the mechanism by which the South blocked legislation it found threatening. High tariffs, federal infrastructure spending directed disproportionately northward, national banking reform, all of it could be stopped as long as the South held enough Senate votes to sustain a veto. If the Western territories became free states, that balance collapsed permanently and irreversibly. The South would become a permanent minority within its own government, and a Northern-dominated Congress would do what the South had always feared it would eventually do. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 cracked the system open. Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois, building the political coalition he needed to route a transcontinental railroad through Chicago, offered the South the repeal of the Missouri Compromise in exchange for their votes. The compromise had drawn a geographical line at 36 degrees 30 minutes latitude, above which slavery was permanently excluded from the territories. Erasing that line opened territories that had been legally closed for 34 years. The response was not merely legislative anger. In Kansas, between 1855 and 1859, pro-slavery settlers from Missouri and anti-slavery immigrants from New England fought a guerrilla war. Towns burned. Militias murdered civilians. John Brown led a group that killed 5 pro-slavery settlers with broadswords at Pottawatomie Creek in May of 1856. The period became known as Bleeding Kansas, and it demonstrated something that no further compromise could conceal. The question of slavery's expansion could not be resolved through legislation. It could only be resolved through force, and both sides were beginning to understand this with a clarity that their political representatives could not afford to acknowledge publicly. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The Supreme Court then removed the legal foundation of containment entirely. In 1857, Chief Justice Roger Taney's decision in Dred Scott v. Sanford declared that Congress had no authority to prohibit slavery in any territory, that enslaved people were property protected by the Fifth Amendment against government seizure without due process, and that black Americans, whether free or enslaved, had no standing in federal court because they were not and could not be citizens of the United States. Taney's ruling was sweeping in a way that his critics recognized immediately as going far beyond what the case required. He did not simply rule against Scott's freedom. He dismantled the legal architecture of 37 years of congressional compromise and declared it all unconstitutional from the beginning. The Missouri Compromise line, the Northwest Ordinance provisions, the territorial exclusions that had been the practical instruments of containment, all of it, according to Taney, had always been void. The ruling was a political gift to the South and a catastrophe for the Republican Party, whose entire platform rested on the congressional authority to exclude slavery from territories that Taney had just declared Congress never possessed. If containment could not be achieved through legislation, and the courts had now foreclosed it entirely, the only remaining instrument was political power, and the only way to hold political power was to win the presidency and hold it long enough to reshape the federal judiciary from the inside through appointments that might eventually produce a different reading of the Constitution. That calculation accelerated the importance of the 1860 election in ways that made compromise on any intermediate ground almost impossible. Lincoln could not run on anything weaker than the containment position without losing his party. The South could not accept even the containment position without accepting the beginning of the end of its political power. The space between those two positions was empty. John Brown's raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry in October of 1859 made the political atmosphere around that goal more volatile than any event since Bleeding Kansas. Brown intended to seize weapons and trigger a mass armed rebellion among the enslaved population of Virginia and the surrounding states. The raid failed within 2 days. Brown was captured, tried for treason in a Virginia court, and hanged in December. What followed in the North was what most alarmed the South. Church bells rang in Boston and New York. Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote that Brown would make the gallows glorious like the cross. Henry David Thoreau called him an angel of light. To Southern readers, the Northern reaction to a man who had attempted to incite mass insurrection was more alarming than the raid itself. It signaled that the gap between Northern political moderation and Northern popular sentiment was narrower than the Republican Party's official platform suggested. Lincoln's election in November of 1860 confirmed what the South had feared. He won without appearing on the ballot in 10 Southern states. His electoral majority was entirely a Northern phenomenon. the first proof in American history that the presidency could be won without a single Southern vote. If the arithmetic of national politics had shifted so decisively, the South faced a future in which it could be outvoted on every question that mattered to it, permanently and without recourse. South Carolina seceded on December 20, 1860, 6 weeks after the election and 3 months before Lincoln took office. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed within weeks. By February of 1861, they had organized themselves as the Confederate States of America, with Jefferson Davis as their president. The secession declarations these states issued are among the most revealing documents the Standard account consistently underreads. They are explicit. Mississippi's declaration states plainly that the state's position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, describing it as the greatest material interest of the world. Georgia's declaration catalogs grievances centered specifically on the question of slavery in the territories and the northern states' refusal to return escaped enslaved people, as required by federal law. South Carolina focuses on the failure of northern states to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act and the election of a president whose opinions and purposes are hostile to slavery. These documents do not speak in abstractions about states' rights as a general constitutional principle. They name what is at stake in direct language. The idea that the war was primarily a conflict about constitutional theory rather than slavery is a construction of the post-war period, an artifact of what historians call the lost cause mythology that the defeated Confederacy assembled in the decades after 1865 to make its defeat into something other than what it was. Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, stated the actual position without ambiguity in his cornerstone speech of March 1861. He declared that the foundations of the new government rested on the great truth that the black man was not equal to the white man, and that slavery, subordination to the superior race, was the black man's natural and normal condition. The vice president of the Confederacy said so plainly, before the first battle, in a public address. The Standard account does not need to speculate about Confederate motivation. The Confederate leadership stated it themselves. The international dimension of the conflict follows directly from the financial architecture that slavery had built. By the late 1850s, Great Britain imported roughly 78% of its cotton from the American South. The mill towns of Lancashire depended on that supply. Hundreds of thousands of workers owed their livelihoods to the continued operation of the American plantation system. The merchant banking houses of London had provided the credit that financed the expansion of the cotton frontier for decades. Jefferson Davis understood this dependency and tried to weaponize it. The Confederate strategy, known as King Cotton diplomacy, rested on a calculation that seemed reasonable on paper. Withhold cotton long enough, and Britain's textile economy would collapse. The political pressure would become irresistible, and the British government would recognize the Confederacy as an independent nation and break the Union blockade. For a period in 1862, the strategy appeared to be working. The cotton famine that hit Lancashire caused genuine economic suffering. Mills closed. Delegations of manufacturers descended on London, asking their government to act. Napoleon III in France was openly sympathetic to Confederate recognition and understood that French action without British support was impossible. The gamble failed for reasons that were themselves deeply financial. Britain and France had stockpiled cotton surpluses from bumper crops in 1860 and 1861 that cushioned the initial shock by months. British manufacturers began diversifying their cotton supply, importing from Egypt, India, and Brazil at higher cost, but with the long-term strategic benefit of reduced American dependency. And Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation of January 1863 reframed the war in terms that made European support for the Confederacy politically impossible. Britain had abolished slavery in its own empire in 1833. To be seen openly supporting a government whose vice president had publicly declared racial slavery to be the cornerstone of its civilization would have been catastrophic for any British government facing its own electorate. The British calculation was never purely moral. A war with the Union would have meant an invasion of Canada, the destruction of the British merchant fleet in Atlantic waters, and the disruption of food imports from Northern American farms that had become a significant element of the British food supply. Cotton weighed against all of that was not a winning exchange, and the men who ran British foreign policy understood the ledger clearly enough. The outcome of the war was determined by economics as much as by armies. The North had 23 million people against the South's 9 million, nearly 4 million of whom were enslaved, and denied the ability to fight on the South's behalf until the final desperate months of the conflict. The North held most of the country's railroad mileage, most of its manufacturing capacity, and the financial infrastructure to sustain a prolonged war. The South had better military leadership in the early years, the defensive advantages of fighting on home territory, and a conviction that European intervention would eventually arrive. None of that was enough to overcome the arithmetic. By 1865, the Confederacy was exhausted. Its rail lines were destroyed, its ports were blockaded, its currency was worthless, and its labor system was dismantling itself from within, as enslaved people escaped in their hundreds of thousands toward Union lines. The 13th Amendment, ratified in December of 1865, formally abolished slavery throughout the United States. It eliminated at a stroke what had been the nation's largest single financial asset. $3.5 billion in property ceased to exist in law. No other nation in the Western Hemisphere ended slavery through a process so catastrophic. Britain compensated its slaveholders when it abolished the institution in 1833. France did the same. In the United States, the slaveholders' compensation was military defeat, and the bill for 4 years of the bloodiest war in American history was paid in 620,000 lives. The war did not only end slavery, it transformed the structure of the American state in ways that would determine the shape of the country for the following century. Before the conflict, the federal government operated within tight constraints, perpetually negotiating between competing regional interests, held in check by the Southern Senate veto that 4 decades of careful tariff and territory management had preserved. After the war, the United States emerged as a centralized national government with the power to conscript soldiers, levy an income tax, issue a unified national currency through the National Banking Acts, and enforce its authority with military force that no state or combination of states could resist. The Homestead Act opened the Western territories to free labor settlement on terms the South had blocked for years. The Pacific Railroad Acts authorized the transcontinental railroad that Stephen Douglas had tried to build by trading away the Missouri Compromise. The Morrill Act established the land-grant university system that seeded agricultural and mechanical colleges across the northern and western states. All of these measures had been held in check by Southern opposition in Congress. With the Confederate states out of the legislative process during Reconstruction, they passed almost without resistance. The war cleared the political obstruction that had prevented Northern industrial capitalism from accessing federal support for 3 decades, and what followed was the most rapid period of industrial expansion the country had ever seen, the Gilded Age, built on federal land grants, federal railroad subsidies, federal tariff protection, and the labor of millions of workers, immigrants and freed people among them, whose wages and conditions were largely unregulated and whose political representation was fragmentary at best. The irony is considerable. The war that freed 4 million people from legal bondage also unleashed the economic forces that would create new forms of exploitation, new concentrations of capital, and new political arrangements in which money, rather than slaveholding, determined who governed and to what end. What historians consistently underweight in the standard account of the Civil War is the degree to which every dimension of the conflict, the tariff disputes, the territorial battles, the constitutional crises, the international diplomacy, the financial instruments, all of it, ran through the institution of slavery as if through a single point. You cannot understand the Tariff of Abominations without understanding the plantation economy that made Southern planters so dependent on cheap imported goods, and you cannot understand that dependency without understanding why the South had no manufacturing of its own, which takes you directly back to the economic logic of slave labor. You cannot understand the Kansas crisis without understanding the soil exhaustion that made the expansion of slavery an economic necessity rather than a preference, which takes you back to the same logic. You cannot understand the financial panics and credit dislocations of the antebellum period without understanding the mortgage instruments backed by human beings that Southern banks created and Northern banks accepted as legitimate collateral, which requires confronting the degree to which the financial systems of both regions were built on the same foundation. The standard account presents the war as a conflict about one thing, or alternatively about something else entirely, when the reality is that the thing and the something else were inseparable from the beginning. Slavery was at the center not because it was one issue among many that happened to be more emotionally charged than the others, but because it was structurally central. It was the organizing logic of the Southern economy, the source of the capital that Northern banks moved and London banks extended credit against, and the political variable that determined the balance of power in Congress on every other question, from tariffs to territory to banking to infrastructure. Remove it from the picture, and the picture dissolves. The war was the endpoint of a process that began the moment the founders tried to hold a slave economy and a free labor economy together under a single constitutional government, and then made a series of choices about how to count the enslaved for purposes of political representation that gave the Southern planter class more power in the federal government than the size of its free population would have justified. Every compromise that followed bought time without resolving the structural incompatibility. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 bought 34 years. The Compromise of 1850 bought a decade. The Kansas-Nebraska Act bought less than a year before violence broke out. Each successive attempt was weaker than the last, because the underlying problem was not a policy disagreement that creative negotiation could bridge. It was a contradiction between two economic systems whose long-term interests pointed in opposite directions on every question of consequence, from trade policy to banking to territorial expansion to the allocation of federal resources, and that contradiction was becoming more acute, not less, as both systems grew. The Southern elite understood this more clearly than most historians give them credit for. They knew that containment meant extinction, not in the immediate term but in the arithmetic of decades, as free states accumulated and the Senate balance shifted and the tools available to block adverse legislation dwindled one by one. They chose war rather than accept a future they could already calculate, and they went into that war with the secession declarations they wrote, naming slavery by name as their cause, confident that they were in the right. The tragedy is not that they were wrong about what containment would eventually produce. The tragedy is what it cost to prove them right, and who paid most of that cost, and how much of what they owed for what they had taken was never collected. The ledger from those years is not closed. The wealth extracted from 4 generations of enslaved labor was never returned, not through Reconstruction, not through any subsequent federal policy, not through any form of compensation or restitution that would have made the erasure of $3.5 billion in stolen human labor even partially whole. The racial order that slavery built was reconstructed in new legal forms through black codes enacted in 1865 and 1866 that bound freed people to labor contracts they could not leave without criminal penalty. Through the convict leasing system that allowed Southern states to rent the labor of imprisoned black men to private companies under conditions that differed from antebellum slavery, mainly in the name applied to them. Through the sharecropping arrangements that kept formerly enslaved people and their descendants tied to the same land, working for the same families, under debt obligations structured to be mathematically impossible to repay. Through the systematic exclusion of black Americans from the federally subsidized wealth-building programs of the 20th century, from the GI Bill provisions that built the white middle class, to the Federal Housing Administration lending practices that blocked black families from the suburban homeownership that became the primary vehicle of generational wealth transfer for the post-war generation. The economic disparities between black and white Americans that the plantation system established in the colonial period were carried forward through Reconstruction's betrayal, through a century of legal discrimination enforced by law and terror in roughly equal measure, and into the present in forms that are measurable in income statistics, wealth gaps, home ownership rates, and incarceration figures. What the financial record shows, when you read it alongside the political account, is that the war resolved the question of legal slavery and left almost everything else intact. The entries made between 1828 and 1865 are still being carried forward. The Civil War was not a finished story. The account has not been settled. The conventional story of the Civil War is, in one sense, correct. It was about slavery. But that answer, offered without the financial architecture underneath it, without the tariff disputes and the mortgage instruments and the London credit lines and the Senate arithmetic and the soil exhaustion and the $3.5 billion in human property that made the whole system move, that answer teaches very little about how such a catastrophe becomes possible. It teaches very little about how a nation can build its prosperity on a foundation that its own stated values condemn, and sustain that contradiction for 8 decades through a series of compromises that grow weaker each time because the underlying pressure grows stronger. The men who made the decisions that led to the war were not for the most part monsters. They were property owners protecting property, politicians managing constituencies, bankers managing risk, diplomats managing alliances. They operated within a system that had been constructed before any of them were born, and they made the calculations that the system rewarded. The result was 620,000 dead, 4 million freed, a nation transformed, and a set of debts that the financial record shows were never fully paid. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.